Another controversial weekend of Formula One racing in Saudi Arabia, and another race that has proved that these new regulations are working. There's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Should this race have even happened? This race has undoubtedly been overshadowed by the events that took place on Friday in Jeddah, as a missile hit the Aramco oil storage facility. The race in Saudi Arabia is widely criticised by drivers as it seems to be taking place purely on the basis that the country is willing to pay in excess of $50 million for the privilege. It's part of a wider step for Formula One as more and more races are being hosted in the Middle East. Following the events on Friday, there was a 4-hour meeting between the drivers, team principals and F1 personnel to determine whether the weekend of racing would continue. Fundamentally, it sounds like the drivers weren't keen to continue the race weekend initially, at least, given the risks. So I think it was fair to ask the question of whether the race could itself have been a target. There was assurance from Saudi officials that the security would be increased to its highest levels, and that the race itself wasn't a target. But that feels rather insignificant, and it begs the question over whether the safety of the team personnel and drivers was really at the forefront of people's minds when it came to the decision to continue with the weekend's planned running. But this isn't the only reason why there's a question over this race, with the circuit itself continuing to be challenging and an accident waiting to happen. Back in December, I gave the circuit an amber box, on the basis that it was dangerous but exciting to watch with the drivers going right to the limit. I was wrong. This track is simply unsafe, and I don't think it's good for the sport. The fact that it only got its Grade 1 homologation sign-off 3 days before the Grand Prix last year is scary to say the least, and it was hardly like the FIA could easily say no, as they would have been all so aware of the implications of that decision. The safety improvements between the two races have been described by the drivers as tiny, and more changes are being called for after a huge qualifying crash for Mick Schumacher, which saw him airlifted to hospital and his car broken into 2 pieces. Fortunately, Schumacher was okay after the incident, something that shows just how far the safety of these cars has improved year on year. F2 driver Cem Bolokbasi had a similar incident in practice as he spun into the barrier and ended up withdrawing from the races with a concussion. But in that F2 incident, it took 3 minutes for the medical car and marshals to get to the scene, which is simply unacceptable. If you're going to have a track that's likely to produce so many accidents, you need to have the finest marshalling team out there to ensure they can support the drivers as soon as possible. So there were calls from multiple angles to cancel this race weekend, and I think there needs to be wider conversations about whether this race can realistically continue into the future on the Jeddah Corniche circuit. So for that reason, Formula One is going to get a red box from me this weekend. But before we take a look at the race itself, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I'm aiming for 50,000 subscribers by the summer break, so if you haven't already done so, it would be great if you could hit the subscribe button to support the channel. Thanks. Heartbreak for Sergio Perez. It was an excellent drive from Sergio Perez on Saturday as he achieved the first pole position of his Formula One career, 11 years after its debut. It was a great lap from the Mexican driver as the Red Bull car looked to be quite strong over 1 lap pace. And at the start of the race, Perez did a brilliant job to hold the lead and actually build a 2-second advantage over Charles Leclerc behind him. But some clever radio calls between Leclerc and the Ferrari pit wall perhaps encouraged the Red Bull team to pit the lead driver earlier than they otherwise might have done. And as is the way with this track, the safety car is never far away. As a result of the subsequent safety car triggered by Latifi hitting the wall in the final corner, Leclerc, Verstappen and Sainz all got ahead of Perez, and he'd gone from 1st to 4th, which was an awful outcome and just simply bad luck for the Red Bull driver. Without that, I think Perez could well have gone on to win it, or at least finish in the top 2. There was, of course, the safety car infringement, with the close call between who came out in front between Perez and Sainz as the Ferrari exited the pits. It was under investigation, but I thought it was well managed from the Red Bull team, as they asked their driver to hand the position back on the restart to ensure that neither they nor the Ferrari team would be at risk of changing places under the safety car. It was a mature and sensible approach, which is in stark contrast to the approaches from the teams last year. Perhaps the announcement from the FIA that they wanted the teams to sort things out between themselves, albeit with the announcement focus on overtakes that happen off the track, might well be working. In the end, Perez was left in no man's land, but it was still definitely a strong weekend and a sign that the gap between Perez and Verstappen in 2022 is likely to be less than the gap between the pair from last year. So despite a 4th place finish, I want to give Sergio Perez a green box for this weekend after he did so well in qualifying and didn't really make any significant mistakes that resulted in him losing out on that top spot. I do think we'll see him take the top step at some point this season, and I'm looking forward to seeing the Red Bulls take the fight to Ferrari this year. Leclerc versus Verstappen is heating up. It was a great battle for the race win in the closing stages, as Verstappen and Leclerc once again fought for the 25 points, and it was another multi-lap battle, just as it was in Bahrain. This circuit rewards patience, with the DRS detection point going into the final hairpin being also important for getting the DRS on the main start-finish straight. We saw this through the race, with some clever moves from Kevin Magnussen when he was under threat from Lewis Hamilton in the earlier stages. It was once again a battle between the two younger drivers at Ferrari and Red Bull in the end though, as Verstappen managed the gap to Leclerc throughout the second stint, ensuring he had enough tyre left to challenge the Ferrari right at the end, and that's exactly what he did. It was a battle that was all about whether Verstappen could get that DRS on the main straight. There was even one moment where the pair of them locked up in an effort to make sure that they were the driver behind going into the hairpin, which actually looked a bit dangerous when they were slowing down considerably. In the end, Verstappen was the driver who made the move stick, but Leclerc was certainly able to fight back, albeit without being able to quite get back past in the end. The competition between these two drivers is certainly heating up, as the race was decided by just half a second in the end. There were some heated moments from Verstappen on the radio as he continued to get stressed about Leclerc's lights on his rear wing, a couple of instances where he thought the Ferrari crossed the pit lane entry line, and even getting stressed about the yellow flags in Sector 1 right at the end. It's similar to the stress we heard from Verstappen in Bahrain even before his power unit failure at the end. So I think this is something to keep an eye on, and even the team were encouraging him to keep calm through the race, and I expect these two will be competing much more closely throughout the rest of the 2022 season. So, it's a green box for the battle between these two drivers, and there is a lot of respect between them for now, but I think we can all acknowledge that this could well be a competition that heats up as we go through the season. Ocon versus Alonso. Alpine had a strong weekend, as it looked like they were the team that took the lead of the midfield. The Alpine team were one of only 3 teams to get 2 cars into Q3, as they had a great opportunity to score a strong haul of points early on in the season. In the race, after Ocon was overtaken by George Russell, Alonso was right on the tail of his teammate, and what subsequently followed was 4 consecutive laps of DRS attempted overtakes down into turn 1, where on the 3rd attempt, Alonso managed to get himself past Ocon for 6th position. But in the end, the pair themselves fell back considerably when compared with George Russell ahead, and Valtteri Bottas and Kevin Magnussen ended up right on the tail of the Alpine pair. I thought Jenson Button made an excellent point on the commentary, as he pointed out that these drivers had the vast majority of the TV time during that section of the race, so the sponsors of those cars would have been very pleased with the coverage they received. But regardless, it was perhaps a mistake from the team to let them hinder each other's races, as they certainly lost out on any opportunity to keep on George Russell's tail, as the Mercedes driver ended up in no man's land himself. In the end, the call from the team came too late, as once Ocon was told to hold position behind Fernando Alonso, Ocon himself lost another position to Valtteri Bottas through a DRS overtake. It seemed like Ocon had just taken too much out of his tyres as he fell further behind the Alfa Romeo in the subsequent laps, and even ended up under pressure from Kevin Magnussen on the hard tyres before the safety car period. What's interesting for me is that these drivers are clearly very evenly matched at Alpine once again, albeit with Alonso ending up well ahead, with the Spaniard not losing any further positions in that first stint. In the end, it was still Ocon who managed to benefit from a race of attrition and finish in the best of the rest spot, and I'm happy that Alpine let them race, as it was by far the most entertainment in those early stages. But at the same time, they probably hurt themselves overall from letting them race, as they lost track positions in the end. So it was an amber box for the Alpine team on this occasion. Reliability, a concern for all teams. It was a fascinating moment around lap 38 as we saw Fernando Alonso's Alpine slowing down considerably and stopping at the pit entry. We also saw Valtteri Bottas's Alfa Romeo retire into the pits, and we saw Daniel Ricciardo's McLaren pull to a stop on the main straight, also coming to a stop at the pit entry. It looked like power units were overheating all over the place, and interestingly, it was 3 different power unit providers that all stopped at the same time, with a Ferrari, a Mercedes, and a Renault powertrain failing. It meant that all power unit providers saw either a DNF or a DNS in the case of Yuki Tsunoda's AlphaTauri, which ground to a halt on his way to the grid after a nightmare weekend with his power unit. There were reliability problems for all power unit manufacturers, and it seems like it's heat related, which was an interesting scenario as this was a night race with cooler conditions. It makes for an exciting scenario, as all teams have tried to shrink the side pod intakes in these regulations as they want to reduce drag wherever they can. What's interesting is that these failures occurred at a race where tyre wear on the hard compound tyre wasn't a particular concern for the drivers, so they were able to push throughout. This is in stark contrast to the Bahrain race where the drivers were perhaps having some more tyre management on their mind. Maybe that was the difference maker as to why so many cars pulled up around the same time in Jeddah. I guess time will tell on that one, but for me, I think that the fact that reliability has been a factor in both races certainly makes things interesting. So is a green box for these new cars creating some challenges for the teams that they aren't quite getting right at this point in time, and the unpredictability that this creates? Honourable mentions. As for the honourable mentions this week, I think we have to recognise a great result and performance from George Russell in the Mercedes. The team that are in the middle ground behind Ferrari and Red Bull are seemingly ahead of the other teams. Russell proved this weekend, and that he can outperform his teammate as Hamilton got knocked out in Q1 and then had to fight his way back to get into the points in the race. Another honourable mention has to go to Lando Norris. He may well have lost out to Esteban Ocon in the end, but if you'd said that McLaren would have been able to finish 7th after their terrible performance last week, I don't think many would have believed you. But here he is, delivering once again and getting into that top 10. So there we have it, 2 races in and 2 different race winners. This season is shaping up to be a real development race and a battle on track between 2 drivers who are ready for the challenge. What do you think I missed from this race? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.